Welcome to NovoEDTalks, where we reveal real-world strategies and expert insights from learning and development professionals. In every episode, we chat with practitioners, course designers, learning strategists, and business leads. We hear about their experiences in the learning industry and predictions for the profession and the trends that they're seeing. But before we get started, a little bit about NovoEd. Founded at Stanford's Social Algorithms Lab in 2012, NovoEd is a people-centric, capability-building platform that combines social and collaborative learning to drive performance readiness at scale. Through cohort-based experiences centered around human interaction, NovoEd taps into collective wisdom, placing each learner at the center of perspective, application, and expertise. Large enterprises such as 3M, GE, Marriott International, and Nestle partner with NovoEd to accelerate their critical initiatives, reconnect teams, and achieve rapid alignment through learning that is felt, experienced, and swiftly transformed into impact. Now, let's meet our guest for today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NovoEDTalks podcast, a space for training trailblazers to get real. My name is Melissa Fisk. I'm the producer of the NovoEDTalks podcast, and today I'm joined by Benjamin Granger, who is the Chief Workplace Psychologist at Qualtrics. Dr. Benjamin Granger serves as a Chief Workplace Psychologist at Qualtrics with over 15 years of experience building experience management programs across the globe. He leads EX through leadership and research initiatives across Qualtrics and the XM Institute. Benjamin, welcome to the NovoEDTalks podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Melissa.
Awesome. Well, why don't you start by just kind of introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your role in your company?
Sure. So I actually am an organizational psychologist by education, and believe it or not, I don't know if you knew this, Melissa, but I started my career in learning and development. So
That's
my
awesome.
very first work that I was doing as a graduate student, and even my first, big boy job, so to speak, out of graduate school, was focused on training and development. So I've got a real passion for it. But today, like you mentioned, I serve as the chief workplace psychologist. Most people ask, "Oh, what in the world is that?" And so, what I do is I lead a lot of the research and the thought leadership that we do at Qualtrics around particularly the employee experience, but also our work has shifted heavily into the customer experience space. So, a lot of my work is research focused, but also we do a lot, and I do a lot of consulting. And so I work with a lot of organizations. And one of the key areas that we work around within that umbrella of the employee experience is the learner experience.
Yeah. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about that and what do you see as some of like the biggest challenges for the learner experience that people are facing today?
I think this will probably resonate with a lot of people because this is all coming from actual client conversations we're having right now. But one of the biggest, at an organizational level, biggest challenges that we're hearing is organizations are shifting toward talking about skills, building skills ontologies in their organizations. And quite frankly, that's freezing people up because as they're looking at the older ways that they've constructed jobs with job descriptions, with competency models, and now they're sitting there thinking, this may be obsolete for what we're about to move into. AI has been a big catalyst to that. It's really daunting for a lot of the HR leaders that I focus on. They're like, I don't know where to start. They know they need to move to it, but they don't know how. When we zoom into the employee and we collect a lot of feedback from employees. We have, for example, just to illustrate that, we have a database, global database that it currently has 31 million employee responses over the last 3 years.
Wow.
And so a lot of that feedback has to do with what they're either equipped with, what's going well, and a big part of it is what they're not equipped with. And so what we're seeing in that feedback now is people struggling with, I don't know what skills to focus on. Do I focus on these AI technical skills? Do I build up my people skills, my human skills? Generally, we're seeing leaders and frontline employees saying that they're very under equipped. They're being asked to do more At least their perception is they're being asked by their companies to do more today than they were yesterday, but they're not feeling any different level of support. So I'd say
Right.
at a high level, we're seeing that both from organizations and also from employees, but they're pointing to the same thing. I don't know what skills to focus on right now.
Right, right. So how do you approach some of those like big workforce development challenges, or how do you suggest people kind of work through all that?
Well, I think firstly, it is helping organizations have the right signal from have those conversations via the feedback, for example. That's the first place. That's core to what we do as a company, is having them have open, honest conversations. Sometimes that is mediated by technology. Back in the day when I started here, that was synonymous with surveys. Now, technology, we have so many tools that we can go beyond just surveys. We don't even use the word surveys all that often. But
Right.
I like to view those opportunities as we're having ongoing, honest conversations with each other so that employees can raise their hand and say, I am struggling with this. I need help with XYZ. So leaders know what to focus on. Sometimes those are sensitive conversations and they need to be done in a confidential, safe space. The other area that we're really focusing on, and this is with all the work that I've done as an organizational psychologist, from focusing on learning and development to I spent 5.5 years focusing on how to select employees, how to measure employee attitudes. When I look at all of that and I look, what is the common denominator of things that drive customer experience, employee experience, hiring, training, you name it? To me, it's leadership. And
Mhm.
that is one of the common denominators. So to your question, how are we helping organizations solve this? We're really pushing them to focus on their leaders. If you can't develop the skills in your leaders, and specifically what we're recommending they do is focus on what we would call those meta skills, the
Okay.
skills that help them to build other skills. So those are things like develop their learning agility, develop a growth mindset about themselves and the people that they lead, develop the ability to learn, to think critically, to develop those emotional intelligence skills, to listen actively. And what's interesting about all that is despite the fact that we're all surrounded by these new technologies, and that's not going to slow down, that's only going to speed up. What we're finding and hypothesizing is it's the unique human skills that are really going to set people apart. And that's what leaders need to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there certain, kind of strategies or approaches that you think teams can use to kind of help these leaders develop these like meta skill sets?
I think one of the things is uh, to the leaders above those leaders, the senior leadership team. One of my big emphasis when I work with those groups is thinking of people as adaptive to their environments. That might seem like commonsensical to everybody listening to this, but so often, Melissa, like when I'm doing consulting with my clients, the questions I get from my clients, my executive clients, is how do we get our employees to do this? We need them to be more fill in the blank. We need our leaders to be more fill in the blank. And the way that the question is phrased, but underneath that is an assumption that we need to develop that skill, which is sometimes true. We need to hire people who are higher on that skill or that ability, which is sometimes true. Not refuting that. But what I challenge them to do is rephrase the question. How can you, as a leader, create an environment that enables people to do that? And because this goes back to the classic, and folks on this podcast will really get this. We can nerd out on this. The transfer of training problem, right? The old school transfer of training problem. You put people through training, they learn, they show that they learn, they pass the test with flying colors, and then they get back on the job and they do nothing different. And
Yeah.
more often than not, that's not because they didn't learn the skill. It's that they don't have the opportunity to practice. The environment that they are now in is not supportive or facilitative of that skill, of practicing that. That's what we're talking about. So I'd say that's the biggest overarching challenge is to get leaders to reframe the way that they think about it. Yeah, certainly there's people who are better at emotional intelligence and active listening than others. That's true. But we can create environments that make that more likely. And let me just simplify it here. I think that is the most fundamental thing that senior leaders can do is to change their mindset and think about creating environments that allow people to develop these meta skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And, kind of, you talked about like solving this problem, but how do you kind of pinpoint or how do you suggest teams like maybe those senior leadership individuals like determine whether or not their other like lower level leadership like is, lacking in some of those skill
Right.
sets? Like, is there a way to measure like skills gaps for those leaders that you kind of suggest?
Well, I would firstly say I'm not the expert in that area. I used to do a lot of that work, training needs analysis, and really digging into the weeds there. So there's probably much better answers than I'm going to give you. But what I'll share is what we tend to focus on, and I think this is a small part of that. This is a small part of the answer, but it's going back to that point I made earlier, giving leaders an avenue to have scalable, honest conversations with employees en masse. And
Hmm.
that we sometimes call employee listening. Again, that used to be synonymous with surveys. But having that avenue, certainly we can go in and we can look at actual behavioral gaps. We can look at performance gaps. Here's what we're expecting. We're not seeing that. That's certainly a signal. But what I think is happening when we go and we have those honest conversations is one, it respects the sovereignty of each human. That sure, we can now detect behavioral patterns to say, well, Ben's not really doing well because we can tell by his traffic or what he's doing to his outputs. We can tell Melissa's not quite there because of this and that. But when do we get a chance to say, what do we think?
Yeah.
I think there's always a space for that. So that's the little small part of that answer that we tend to focus on. But I think it's an important point and it's a foundational point.
Absolutely. And it's something that, like a survey, for example, can't measure because it might be that a leader isn't focusing on something because they don't see the benefit for the overall like business impact or something. And then
Yeah.
that's a totally different thing, like a conversation that needs to be had as to like why they're not, you know, moving forward with that or why they don't believe in that.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
do you have any kind of like, you know, data points or core KPIs that you look to in the work that you're doing?
We do. It's all over the place, but I would say one of the common ones that we look at as a criterion for investments that leaders make into the employee experience. And a lot of times that's into how we develop skills, how do we develop competencies, how do we develop the things, create the environment that enables people to do that. One of the really common ones that we use as a criterion is actually what customers think. And so
Mm,
this is
right.
really common in B2C industries
Right.
where you have call centers, you have retail locations, even digital experience to some degree where you have a lot of traffic and direct interaction of lots of customers with either frontline employees or very transactional products and services. Some of them might be online. And so that's one of the things we tend to look at very heavily is what are the decisions that leaders make and investments they make into employees that have a downstream impact on customer attitudes and then subsequently customer behaviors. And every now and then, and this gets tricky, this gets hard because this is a long analytical chain. You get really nerdy with the statistics here. But you can even go further and say, how do those customer behaviors manifest themselves into more revenue and profitability? But
Yeah.
again, those get really complicated. But I'll give you some examples of some, and specifically where training showed up as particularly critical.
Yeah.
We have one of our clients is a very, very large global fast food chain, quick serve restaurant chain. And they were in the process of overhauling the way that they go out and they collect feedback from their consumers who came into their locations, picked up food and left, and also their employees. And so we did an analysis in their UK and Ireland business. And in that business, there was thousands of locations across UK and Ireland. And there was a lot of autonomy. Different franchisees, different managers could equip employees the way they wanted to. This is a perfect statistical test case, by the way, for us data nerds, right? You want there to be a lot of variability.
Yes.
So we went in there and we said, okay, well, what was it about the employee experience? What was going on in those locations who are generating really strong customer feedback? And the same question, what was going on in those locations that were doing awful? Like customers didn't like the order was not right, they didn't like the food, and they were doing terrible financially. One of the biggest predictors was whether employees felt trained and equipped. That was not only had an indirect relationship through engagement. In other words, if I'm more trained, I'm more equipped, I'm more supported by my manager, that leads me to be more engaged, but it had a direct relationship specifically. Customers could tell very quickly whether employees were new based on the order accuracy. And that's one of the things we detected. But more importantly, we were able to track that down and say those locations who were in the top quartile, where employees really felt well equipped and supported, they generated 5 million pounds more per year than
Wow.
locations that were in the bottom quartile. We talk
Wow.
about get the attention of franchisees.
Yeah.
Let me give you one really quick one. I'll go quickly.
Yeah. No,
This was a German retailer, famous German retailer.
yeah.
And we looked at locations in Germany where they had, again, a lot of discretion at the general manager level. We wanted to look at what was going on among those retail locations that was driving good customer experience. We looked at autonomy. We thought, hey, the degree of autonomy that a frontline sales rep had probably would be have a good relationship with how customers felt. In other words, you go to the store, you buy some things, or you bring a return, and the employee saying, "Oh, I got to go check with my manager." That's annoying.
Yeah.
Well, what
Right.
we found was that autonomy alone had no relationship with customer satisfaction. That kind of baffled us until we added whether people felt trained in the mix. And what we found was when employees felt well equipped and trained and supported by their leaders, and that was paired with a high degree of autonomy, that led to dramatically better customer experience. But when leaders gave employees autonomy, like Ben, Melissa, you got it, but I'm gone and I'm not supporting you, that led to dramatically worse customer
Yeah.
experience. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think we
No.
see that show up over and over again
Yeah.
and looking at hard criteria.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And that my next question was going to be, do you have a case study? And both of those were
There you
incredibly
go.
powerful. So that's amazing. And yeah, you kind of assume maybe, yeah, look at the customer experience and see what that looks like to showcase what we're doing. But I love how you've broken it down into kind of focusing on those things of, are they equipped and trained, and how do they feel about being equipped and trained? And then do they have autonomy or not? Like that's again, those two data points, right, in a silo are tell a very different picture than when you combine them and
Right.
behind that, which is incredible. So I think that's looking at it from a very like data perspective for all the data nerds out there, but also, a customer experience, like people to people perspective. So I think that those both of those case studies are very, very powerful. What role does technology play in kind of the work that you do? And, are there certain tools or platforms that you think, people should be relying on to maybe enhance employee experiences?
It's central to what we do. And I think that's an important point is we are primarily a software company
Mhm.
and we equip, in my view, this is my view, this isn't the official stance of the company, but my view is that we provide organizations with technology that help them to engage in honest conversations with their stakeholders. I think at the core, that's what we're doing.
I love,
And sometimes, like we talked about earlier, Melissa, like sometimes those are sensitive conversations. And when you're having, and I use this analogy a lot, if your skip level leader called you in and said, "Hey, I want to have a raw conversation, and I just want you to let loose. Who is actually going to let loose?
Right. People are like,
Maybe
I've been living as a person in society too long. I'm not going to do that, you know?
exactly.
Like, no.
Common sense tells you, maybe there's some very candid people out there, and God bless them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I admire that.
Yeah.
But most people
Absolutely.
won't,
Yeah, exactly.
especially when they're surrounded by all these power distance artifacts. So we
Right.
got to, sure, you absolutely can have one-on-ones, you can do your skip levels, and you should do that. You should be having focus groups, but sometimes people need a good confidential space to say, I don't think the way we're collaborating across departments is good. I don't think I don't understand how my work contributes to what the rest of this organization is doing. So that's why I think it's so important that we have technology to facilitate a lot of those conversations. And it's also given us not only the ability to keep those scalable and confidential, but it's also given us new tools. So another way I like to think about this, kind of playing on that analogy of a conversation, is any good conversation, like the one we're having now, is two-way.
Yeah.
You know, in a good conversation, both parties get that opportunity to focus on the things they need to focus on. Historically, many organizations have engaged in very one-way conversations.
Sure.
And so that's a big part. So again, technology is critical to what we do, and I think it's going to become even more critical as time goes on.
Absolutely. Let me ask you really quick, kind of going off track a little bit here, but a lot of what you're talking about really to me sounds to thing that like confidential space that you mentioned. Like a lot of that sometimes comes out of like mentorship programs within organizations. Talk to me a little bit about what you think about mentorship programs for organizations.
I'm so glad you pointed this out. We did a study, I think it may have been in 2023, 2024. I can't recall. It's one of those years. And we partnered with Mindshare Partners. And we were very interested in looking at the perspective of employees on different ways that they were trained and equipped and particularly mentored. And there were some interesting things we picked up on that. One was out of all of the different developmental activities we included, formal training, informal training, training inside your organization, training outside your organization, all these things. Mentoring, one-to-one mentoring was listed as by far the most important to employees.
Wow.
And interestingly, we asked about, well, okay, what sort of mentoring do you find most valuable? Mentoring on uniquely human skills and leadership skills were pointed out within mentoring as the most important. And here's another interesting snippet from that. We asked about what are the mediums that you prefer when you get mentored, for example, on
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
Do you want that to be via technology? Do you want that to be in person? In person one.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a meta point that, and it doesn't surprise me as a psychologist, that there's certainly a space for technology mediated mentoring. There's certainly a time and a space for AI mentoring. Some people actually prefer that for certain categories,
Yeah.
but mentoring showed up as incredibly important. It showed up, and interestingly, not just mentees, but mentors.
Yeah.
People who had participated in mentorship reported that as the most fulfilling activity,
Yeah.
and they wanted it to be in person, visceral, human, and they want to learn human skills from other humans. That to
Yeah.
me, that's very telling.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's so powerful. I'd love to, look at that study if you can find it as a
I'll
follow-up.
find it.
But no,
Yeah.
I think that's so true, and it's so powerful. I think we're really seeing that like become more and more of a powerful tool that people are thinking of more so like falling into the L&D space, right? Where it's because they're learning
Mm.
so much like from men, even though it's typically like treated as a different thing, a mentorship program, the skill sets that are learned in those programs are so powerful that it's really starting to kind of, blend the lines of L&D mentorship and like bringing it as one.
Such a good point. And one other thing that jogged my memory too, a minority of employees reported having access to formal mentoring. And if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, I don't want to butcher this, but it was somewhere in like it was sub 50%. And I'm going to be conservative and say it was in the 40s. It may have been in the 30s, but a
Mm.
minority of employees reported access to that. So I think your point there is really good that not thinking of those, right? In practice, they might feel separate, but should they be?
Yeah. Yeah. Like as we're moving forward and everything, tech's coming at us so quickly. And it's like we
Right.
need to learn, like, we need to be learning and adapting constantly, it seems like, so, and sometimes the best, most
Exactly.
fruitful way to do that is like with an individual who's, been in a position where they've had to like ride the waves of change quickly and adapt quickly and change with technologies and things like that. So I think there's like almost camaraderie too that can be shared there, which is really powerful.
Such a good point. One other quick point there. Sorry to go off script here, but what I have a clinical psychologist friend, and I use this all the time. But she has a great line that technology and AI agents can tactically do everything a person can do in a counseling or a mentoring relationship, tactically
Right,
on paper. But
right.
there's something that it can never do, and that is be another human who cares about another human. And it makes a whole world of difference.
It really does. It's so true. Thinking about just kind of, employee experience in general, all the things we've been talking about, what have you seen as some of the biggest takeaways over the past 5 years?
I think a big meta takeaway for me, this is going to sound wishy-washy at first, but I'll explain it, is, and I think it was Jada Smith in one of the Matrix movies said this great line where she's like,
Love that.
Morpheus, some things change and some things don't. And I'd say that when we look at the employee experience rings very true. But let me explain that because again, it sounds kind of wishy-washy and consultancy, like it depends, right? Uh, um, the way that the specific manifestations of the employee experience. Are we working remotely versus an office? That's changed since COVID. That's changed. The technology we use, us having supercomputers in our pockets versus what our parents had, that's changed, of course. And that manifests itself in different ways.
Sure.
That is absolutely true. That's obvious. But what I find really helpful, especially as we look at a future that is highly uncertain, it's likely to move faster than our minds can even conceptualize. And that's scary. So that makes it hard. If we believe that everything's going to change, then that makes it so daunting and paralyzing back to those leaders trying to figure out how to shift the skills. But I think it's really helpful to think about the stuff that doesn't change. And this is where you get deep into the needs of humans. Humans really have three fundamental needs: the need to affiliate, the need to achieve, and the need to have some control or power.
Mm.
And that you can go back and look at, and I study history too,
Yeah.
from a psychological perspective. You go back and you look at, well, people were always working and living in groups. We do that today. It
Mhm.
gives us an opportunity to achieve something, to contribute something to the group. That's important to just about everybody on the planet. And all of us have some degree of need to have some control over our lives, right?
Mhm.
And McClellan called that power. That has a negative connotation today, but really what he meant was like self-efficacy and control.
Right.
Those things are not going to change. And so I think from an employee experience standpoint, as a leader, as a somebody who's overseeing learning, who's leading people, who's leading an organization department, thinking about it in that way. Sure, things will change and we have to pay attention to that. But where the real money might be is focusing on the things that will not change. People are always going to be social. People are always going to need that opportunity to use work as a need to achieve. People are going to always need some control. Can we
Yeah,
find creative ways to meet those needs and keep people fulfilled and happy and productive?
absolutely. I think that's so powerful. I've never heard that before, but I think that it's so simple, but if you think about it, it really like applies to basically everyone who's working in
Yeah,
the workforce today and is so important and a cornerstone of what they're doing, why they're doing it, all of that.
exactly.
Benjamin, to close on a positive note, what's the most important lesson that you've learned as a leader that you'd pass on to someone just starting out as their journey?
This will be a little different than what we've talked about, but I've been very influenced by the work of the Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky back in the 70s and their work on prospect theory and all that good stuff. And one of the greatest pieces of advice that I picked up from that work, and I apply it today, and it works great, is sleep on it and delay your intuition. And so that's really difficult for folks younger, who are a little earlier in their career where they have a really tough meeting or they have a really tough decision and it's just eating away at them. Look, I go through this weekly still. And you want to just respond and lash out. And you want to get frustrated and you think, oh my goodness, you start ruminating. I'm like, am I going to lose my job? All this stuff is totally normal. So everybody goes through it at some point. Just sleep on it.
Yeah.
And what happens the next day? And anticipating that when you feel it in the moment and saying, I know I'm going to react emotionally, and that is perfectly normal. And that intuition, that gut feel, that's important, but
Yeah.
sleep on it. And I
Yeah.
love Kahneman's advice. Intuition matters. That gut feel that we get, that intuition that we get, it matters. We should pay attention to it. We should not act on it immediately, but it should be a part that we consider at the very end of a well thought out process of thinking and consider it at the end. And that's something that's really hard for people younger in their career to do. But that is something that has dramatically changed the way that I work and I lead, and I think is good advice to share with others.
Absolutely. Especially people like just starting out. That resonates with me so deeply just because I think we're all it's we're because like we're in such a rapid environment. I feel like especially more so we feel like pressured to almost like react immediately because it's like
Yes.
everything is so instant. And so it's like you almost have to like really really focus on learning that maybe more so nowadays. So I think that's phenomenal advice. Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us today on the NovoEd Talks podcast. Your perspectives have been really interesting and I know our listeners are going to love them.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast.
Awesome. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in once again to the NovoEd Talks podcast.